Fear the Pale Blue, What We Left Ourselves, Episode 5. Custody, the windows were open now. She'd started keeping them closed after the read-in, even through the June heat, and she hadn't examined why at the time. The ceiling fan had run on its lowest setting, and the apartment had sat in its sealed, recycled air for 3 weeks before she'd opened the kitchen window one morning without deciding to, and then the bedroom window the next day, and then the front window. And by the second week of July, the apartment had acquired the quality of a summer space that had made its peace with its climate. Warm, cross-ventilated, the sounds of 30th Street arriving at whatever volume the hour required. She'd been back from Philadelphia for 4 days. The first day she'd done almost nothing. She'd filed the report at 9 in the evening and gone to bed before midnight and slept without interruption until 6:40, which was unusual enough that she noted it. The sleep had the quality of a body deciding on its own terms that it had finished with something, and she respected that without examining it too closely. She'd made coffee in the morning and sat at the kitchen table for an hour not working, which was its own kind of work, and then she'd taken a long walk through Glover Archbold and come back along the canal and eaten lunch and read for 2 hours and gone to bed at 10:30. The second day she'd gone through the Tier 5 index. Not urgently. She'd made the query from her phone during a morning walk, sitting on a bench near the P Street Bridge for 20 minutes while the query returned, and the second cluster was still there, unchanged, and the first pattern was still there, unchanged, and she'd added 2 lines to the legal pad and come home and made dinner and done nothing else operational for the rest of the day. By the third day, the apartment had begun to acquire the texture of a space that was being inhabited without being worked in, which was a texture she didn't often give it. A jacket hung on the back of a chair instead of in the closet. A coffee mug left on the windowsill rather than washed and returned. The legal pad on the kitchen table where she could see it without having to go get it. She'd reorganized nothing and cleaned nothing and made no decisions about the space. It had simply relaxed into a version of itself that wasn't organized around operational readiness, and she'd let it. The authentication report had gone in on the evening of the 4th, accurate and complete, and she received no acknowledgement and no follow-on assignment since. The program had what it had sent her to collect. Whatever had been inside the matte gray case was moving upward through channels she couldn't see, and the channels had closed behind it. And now she was in the between period with the watching place sitting full under her attention and nothing operational to do with what was in it. The between periods had changed since the read-in. Before, they'd been reset, the operational machinery of her mind clearing between runs, functional and essentially neutral. Now they had a texture she was still learning to name. Not anxiety, more like the attentiveness of someone in a room who believes the phone is about to ring but has no reason for that belief, just the absence of surprise that would accompany its ringing. She moved through the apartment's rhythms in this state and didn't examine it directly because examining it wouldn't change anything, and she had a trained aversion to spending attention on things she couldn't act on. The sleep improved. That was the first thing she noted clinically, without drawing conclusions from it. Walking in the mornings, eating with more care than she usually did between assignments. These also noted, also without conclusions. On Wednesday, she walked south along the C&O Canal towpath and stood at the bridge at Thomas Jefferson Street, watching a family of ducks work against the current, 3 adults and 7 ducklings in no fixed formation, pausing periodically in an eddy near the bank as though conferring. A man in his 60s sat on a nearby bench reading a broadsheet newspaper folded back on itself, in the way people had been folding broadsheets for 150 years, and he didn't look up. The lock at 30th Street had a canal boat going through it, the lock tender in a canvas hat doing the work with the economy of someone who'd done it 10,000 times, and the sound of water through the lock gates was the sound the canal had made in this same place since the 1820s, which she let herself notice before setting it aside and going back to watching the ducks. She stood at the railing for 20 minutes. The man with the newspaper finished it and left without acknowledging her, and she respected him for it. The towpath on the way back had the quality of a walking route she'd used enough times that it had stopped requiring attention, which left the attention free for other things. The canal was low for July, lower than she'd seen it in 3 years, the waterline leaving a pale mineral stain on the stone walls where the water had been in May. A jogger passed going the other direction, earbuds in, not making eye contact, and she moved to the edge of the path without thinking about it. Under the M Street bridge, the light changed, the overpass throwing a band of shadow across the water and the path and the far bank, and she stood in it for a moment before continuing on. 2 cyclists passed, and then the path was empty again in both directions, the canal running through the middle of the city with the indifference of water that has no interest in what it runs through. She had been thinking, while she watched the ducks, and while she watched the lock tender, and while she stood in the bridge shadow, about the quality of the waiting she was in. It was different from other waiting she'd done. In 15 years of operational work, she'd waited in cars and corridors and rented rooms, waited for people to appear and situations to develop and windows to open. And all of that waiting had been pointed at something she could name, directed toward an event she was preparing to respond to. The waiting she was in now was pointed at something she couldn't name, which was different, a difference she was still working out. No response to prepare, because she didn't know what she'd be responding to. Staying available was the only available mode, and it wasn't an operational category she had prior experience with. Back at the apartment, she made lunch from what was in the refrigerator, ate standing at the counter, and read for 2 hours. One of the books she'd been meaning to get to since spring. She read it with the attention she could spare, which was most of her attention, which was more than she'd been able to give anything for reading in the weeks right after the read-in. That was improvement of a kind. She noted it the way she noted the better sleep, as data, held lightly, not yet usable. On Thursday morning, she picked up a jacket she'd left at the dry cleaner in March, the ticket gone soft in the pocket she'd stored it in. She stopped at the bookstore on Wisconsin and bought 3 books she probably wouldn't read immediately, chose them on instinct while moving through the stacks with the purposelessness of a person using a task as an excuse to be somewhere that wasn't the apartment. At the market on Prospect, the checkout line had a young woman whose toddler was systematically unloading a candy display, while the woman negotiated a price discrepancy with the cashier. The woman handling both with the same calm, parallel attention of someone who had long since learned to operate 2 cognitive threads simultaneously. The toddler got 4 candies onto the belt before being retrieved with efficient tenderness, and the candies went back to the rack, and the price discrepancy was resolved, and the whole transaction concluded without either thread dropping. She watched the toddler, the focused determination of a small person executing a plan that would obviously fail, and stayed a beat too long at the checkout after paying, not wanting to stop watching, and then made herself go. 30th Street home, coffee and refrigerator things away, clean jacket in the closet, the 3 books on the kitchen table next to the legal pad. It was Thursday evening, July 10th, and nothing had arrived. She sat at the kitchen table with one of the books open in front of her, read 3 pages, set it down, looked at the legal pad which had been on the table for 4 days and which she'd been avoiding looking at directly because not looking was its own kind of attention, the kind that held things in the periphery rather than the center. She looked at it for a moment now, directly. 4 columns, the same 4 columns from the P Street back office, the same legible shorthand compressed into lines that would never become a report. 4 columns and the second cluster and the inferred contents of a courier case. She didn't open it. Through the kitchen window, someone was mowing a lawn a few houses down, the sound arriving already softened by the distance and the intervening street, becoming almost pleasant at this remove. The kitchen window had been open since Tuesday. The oak on the street outside the front window was in its full July canopy, converting whatever wind came off the Potomac into its own sound. She was still at the table when the channel opened. This is the inadequate way to describe what happened, but there isn't a better one. The channel opened. No sound. No visible change in the room. Her phone didn't alert. The mower outside continued through its passes. The legal pad was on the table. The kitchen window was still open. The July light was declining toward evening in the specific amber shift that happened to Georgetown row houses when the sun got low enough that the oak became part of the light rather than an obstacle to it. She'd been reading, had put the book down 3 minutes before face up on the table, which meant she'd expected to go back to it. There was a glass of water she'd poured and not touched since afternoon. The ceiling fan was moving at its lowest setting. All of this was present to her with the same clarity it had been present with at 3 in the afternoon, and at 5, and at 6:30 when she'd gotten up to close the front window against the evening traffic, and then opened it again because the evening traffic wasn't loud enough to matter. The room was the room it had always been, and yet something had changed. She sat without moving for a long time. The mower finished its passes and stopped, and the neighborhood quiet it left behind had the quality of a silence she hadn't noticed was absent until it arrived. A car on 30th Street. The Oak. From somewhere on the same floor, a door opened and closed, 2 footsteps on hardwood, and then nothing. The apartment below her was cooking something. All of it was exactly what it had always been at this hour in this apartment in this building, and she was sitting in the middle of it with something that hadn't been present 60 seconds before and was present now, and the difficulty of naming it was itself information. She didn't move. The room continued to exist around her unchanged. The legal pad, the books, the water glass she'd been meaning to return to the kitchen since morning. The shadow of the oak across the kitchen floor had shifted with the hour the way it always shifted, all of it exactly as it had been 60 seconds before. She sat in the stillness and let her mind do what it did in situations she had no protocol for, which was work the available information without forcing a conclusion. What had changed was not the room. What had changed was that something had become aware of her, and she had become aware of its awareness. And the becoming aware was not a sensation she had a prior category for, which was itself the most precise information she had about its nature, not the ICD. She knew what the ICD felt like from the inside, its routing, its channels, its administrative weight. This was not that structure. This was something that had found her clearance and come through it in a form the clearance hadn't been designed to permit. She stayed with this for a long time before she established anything. The room continued. The oak outside. The evening light doing what it did. From downstairs, at some point during the long stillness she was in, a television came on, the low murmur of a program she couldn't identify, and then went off again. The fan turned its circles. Her breathing was even, which she noted, because even breathing was information about her state, and her state was information she was gathering along with everything else. She wasn't afraid. Fear had been present early in the work, in ways she'd learned to process, and then learned to anticipate, and then learned to note without giving them more than their due. Fear was information. Its presence told her something, and its absence told her something. Sitting at the kitchen table in the July evening with something present in the room that hadn't been present before, she was not afraid, which told her what she needed to know about the nature of what was present, and also told her where she was after 15 years and 3 months of read-in. And she let both of those observations sit alongside everything else she was gathering without assigning them more weight than they deserved yet. The presence had the quality of patience. She registered that and held it. It wasn't threatening her. That was the first thing to establish, and she established it carefully, checking the available information the way she'd check a room before entry, looking for the discrepancy that would tell her the read was wrong. She didn't find one. Not threatening was different from safe. She knew that distinction precisely, but it was the relevant information for right now, and she held it and kept working. The contact had the quality of something that had been looking for exactly her, not the ICD, not level 0, her. And it was waiting, in whatever sense the word applied, for her to understand that. The reading gave her the frame. That was the second thing to establish. 3 months ago, she'd been taken to a facility 11 minutes below the Nevada desert and told 5 things in sequence by a man who'd been in the program before 1977. The signal, the echo, the stratum, the origin, the count. She'd held each one in the order it arrived, let each one change the frame for the next. The read-in had given her a frame she hadn't previously had, and the frame was what she was using now, sitting at the kitchen table with the July light moving across the floor, and something present in her apartment that hadn't been present that morning. The echo. The back channel had been one-directional for 11 years. Information from them to the ICD, context, history, the framework for understanding what humanity was approaching. 11 years of giving without asking. The contact event on the flight from Denver 6 months ago. She'd been in seat 24B on a United flight, and a frequency had activated for 11 seconds on a channel that couldn't penetrate an aluminum airframe, and she'd held it open against every protocol she'd ever been trained to follow. She'd known she was breaking protocol, and she'd held it anyway. That had been the end of the back-channel phase. This was what came after. She sat with that understanding for a long time without moving to the next thing. The mower outside had finished its passes. The street had gone to the pre-evening quiet it settled into around 7 in summer. A bicycle bell somewhere, the sound of someone's screen door. The oak outside moving slightly now, a very light wind off the Potomac finally making it this far in. The presence in the room, the contact, the opening of whatever this was, had the quality of something she could close if she chose to. It wasn't being done to her. The distinction was not subtle. She'd spent 15 years in work that was done to other people, and she understood the difference between receiving and being acted upon. This was receiving. The offer required her to extend herself toward it, and if she didn't extend herself, it would close, and the closed version of this moment was one of the options. She let herself feel the shape of what was being offered. Not a file, not text, not a voice. The inadequacy of language here was its own information. She'd learned to treat the thing she couldn't describe as precisely as the thing she could describe, because the gap between available language and available experience was itself a data point. What arrived through the clearance she carried was not information in any format she could transcribe. It was more like, and here she stopped on the more like, held it, noted that reaching for analogy was what her mind did when it ran against something it hadn't been built to process. It was more like understanding she'd already been moving toward, arriving from the direction she hadn't been looking. Go, be present. Recover what being present gives you. Carry it back. She went through the components the way she went through anything she intended to hold rather than file, slowly, with the discipline of someone who had learned not to reach conclusions before she'd looked at everything the available information could tell her. Go. A location she didn't have yet, a destination implied by the ask without being contained in it. She held the absence of that detail the way you held the knowledge that a missing piece existed, not with frustration but with the awareness that the missing piece was missing on purpose. The weather was here. The where would come when the weather was resolved. Be present. Not observationally present, not operationally present. Physically present, her body in a place she couldn't yet name. The requirement of physical presence, something she could feel the weight of without knowing yet where that place was. Physical presence as a requirement was information about what was there. Whatever it was needed a human being in its proximity, the inheritor species standing in a location with all its biology intact. The echo could have gone. The ICD could have sent a machine. But they hadn't been sent because what was there required someone to be there in the way only a person could be there. Recover. This word against the background of everything the read-in had given her. The prior peak, the reset, what had been left behind, what had been waiting in the dark for 30,000 years or more. The word had an object. The object was something the prior peak had left for a future iteration of itself, and the future iteration was her generation, and the something had been waiting with the patience of a thing placed there deliberately. What the something was, she didn't know. It had been left on purpose, for this moment, for someone with exactly her clearance and her history, and the accumulation of things she'd been carrying since, before the reading gave her the frame to understand what she was carrying. Carry it back. She understood this with the comprehension of someone who had been carrying things for 15 years without putting them down, who had built a drawer and a watching place in 15 years of accumulated weight, and had not yet found the thing heavy enough to make her set any of it down. The ask was connected to the count, the threshold, the 14 values descending to one that Vera Sokolova had told her about in a cafe in Berlin. The same order she hadn't reported to anyone, that had been sitting in the drawer with the gradient file and the data chip and everything else she'd been carrying since before the reading gave her the frame to understand what she'd been carrying. The ask was connected to all of it, and the connection wasn't a surprise, and the absence of surprise was information. She'd been moving toward this for longer than she'd known she was moving toward it. She also understood, with a clarity that arrived the way operational clarity arrived, without announcing itself, that the ask had been sent to her. not through the ICD's chain, not to level 0, not to the program as institution, not routed through any of the administrative architecture she'd been mapping since the read-in. To her, through her clearance, because of what she was and what she'd been carrying, things she couldn't fully name but could feel the shape of. The drawer, the photograph, the 46, the way she had been carrying things for 15 years without putting them down. That configuration had pointed the ask in her direction, and she didn't know yet which element of the configuration was the deciding one, and she held that question the way she held everything that wasn't yet resolvable, present on the surface, not filed, attended to. The reporting question was there. The way she ran operational questions, without sentiment. Who would she report to? What would the report contain? What would happen to the report once she filed it? The ICD had an oversight function. She could file a report through her channel. The report would move upward through the same Tier 5 architecture she'd spent 4 days mapping in the back office on P Street, and she didn't know where in that architecture the person who had been managing her channel lived, and she didn't know whether the person managing her channel and the person who would receive her report were connected. She didn't know enough to choose a recipient with any confidence the report wouldn't arrive somewhere it wasn't supposed to. Filing a report would also close the channel. That wasn't sentiment. It was operational assessment. Reporting the contact meant handing it to the machine, and handing it to the machine meant the machine would process it the way the machine processed things, which was by routing it through the same infrastructure she'd spent 4 days establishing she didn't trust. The machine would contain the contact. That was what the machine did with things it didn't understand. It contained them. It routed them to the appropriate level, and the appropriate level made a determination about what the contact was and what the response should be, and the response would come back down the chain changed by everything the chain was. She sat with the question for a while longer. The channel was still open. She'd been aware of its continuance the way you were aware of a held breath, not with effort, just with the maintenance of an awareness that something was there and was waiting and had not closed on its own. It wouldn't close on its own. She understood that. The close would be her action, her choosing to close it, and the choosing not to was also a choice, and she'd been making that choice since the moment she'd recognized what had arrived. She thought about the plane. 6 months ago on a United flight from Denver to Dulles, seat 24B, a device in the overhead bin had activated on a frequency that couldn't penetrate the aluminum of the fuselage, and she'd held the channel open for 11 seconds against every protocol she'd ever been trained to follow. She'd known she was breaking protocol and held it anyway. At the time, she hadn't known what she was doing. She'd understood she was doing something, had understood the weight of the not closing, but the weight had been about the 11 seconds themselves, not about what came after. What came after she hadn't known. Now she knew. The kitchen table in a Georgetown apartment with the July Street outside and the oak in the window and the garlic from downstairs in the air. Not authorized. The machine hadn't sanctioned her for this and possibly couldn't survive knowing she'd accepted it. The cost wouldn't arrive all at once, the way the read-in's cost hadn't arrived all at once and was still arriving. The ask had come to her, which meant she was the person who had to decide. She sat with that for a long time, and then she understood that she had already made the decision by the way she was sitting with it. The decision wasn't a form she signed, not a button pressed, not a word spoken into any device. The decision was the not closing. The channel was open and she was in its opening and she was not closing it, which was the same decision she'd made on a United flight 6 months ago in seat 24B, holding 11 seconds open when every protocol she'd ever been trained to follow said close it. Except that time she hadn't known what she was doing, and this time she did. This time she understood the size of what she was not closing. Not authorized. Unable to be undone once held long enough. The instrument through which something outside the machine was attempting to act. That was what she was. The machine hadn't sanctioned her for this function and possibly couldn't survive knowing she'd accepted it. She understood all of that, and she did not close the channel. Walt was at his desk when she went downstairs. Not the extinguisher circuit tonight, just the desk. The radio going low with a game in the middle innings. The crossword in the margin of the maintenance log. The reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He'd worked in this building for 28 years. She'd lived in the building for 3, and in 3 years he hadn't once asked her where she was going when she left, or where she'd been when she came back, which she'd stopped thinking of as unusual, and had started thinking of as its own form of care. The kind that made room without requiring explanation. He looked up when she came through the stairwell door. "Still got that Philadelphia weather following you," he said, which meant it was warm and he'd noticed she'd gone and he was glad she was back, all in a sentence that didn't require her to confirm or deny any of those things. "Feels like it," she said. He made a mark in the log. "Window latch on 2 is sticking again. Put in for the part. Thanks. Supposed to be cooler by the weekend." He picked up his thermos and looked at it in the way that meant it had gone cold on him and he was deciding whether to bother. "You need anything?" "I'm good." He nodded and went back to the crossword, and she was through the lobby and out the door before he'd finished the next entry. She walked around the block twice, not for any operational reason. No surveillance check, no route variation for coverage. She was moving through the evening because the evening was there, and because the Georgetown streets in July at 8 o'clock had a quality she'd been living with for 3 years and had stopped noticing until recently, when she'd started noticing things she'd stopped noticing. The particular heave of the tree root on the north side of Dumbarton between 30th and 31st. The corner store that had been there longer than anyone she'd asked could remember, with the bell above the door that rang at a slightly sharper pitch than you expected. The way the brick on the south face of the row house at the corner of 30th and N held the day's heat until well after dark, so that walking past it in the evening was always slightly warmer than walking past the identical brick on the other 3 corners. The neighborhood in July had a quality she'd been observing more carefully since the read-in, the way she'd been observing everything more carefully. Before the read-in, the neighborhood had been the space between the work and the sleep, the texture of a life that existed to make the work sustainable, and she'd moved through it with the half attention she'd given everything that wasn't operational. Since the read-in, she'd been giving it more. Not because anything about the neighborhood had changed. It was exactly the same neighborhood, the same oak on 30th, the same crack in the sidewalk outside the dry cleaner that had been there since she'd moved in and would be there after she left. But she understood now what the neighborhood was, what any of this was. The city and the people in it, and the ordinary texture of a July evening in a residential neighborhood. All of it running on the surface of something very old and very large and almost entirely unknown to the people living their July lives in it. Fear of that she didn't have. She'd established that earlier. What she was, sitting now with the not closed channel and the walk around the block, was something she didn't have a prior word for either. Not awe exactly. Not dread. Something more like the feeling she sometimes had at the end of a long operational sequence, when the thing was done and she was on the other side of it and the doing of it was already becoming the past. The feeling of being inside history rather than outside it. She walked past the corner store twice and the bell rang twice, once going and once coming back, and the second time she stood in front of the window for a moment. The sun-faded lottery advertisement, the poster for a concert series that had already happened, the handwritten sign about ice in the back. None of it was interesting. She stood there anyway briefly, because the evening permitted it, and because the corner store had been there longer than she'd been in the neighborhood and would probably be there after she left, and the continuity of that was something she wanted to register. The channel was still open. She could feel its continuance the way she'd been feeling it for over an hour. Not with effort, not with active maintenance, just with the awareness of a thing present and ongoing. An hour of not closing it. Walt had been at his desk with the radio and the crossword, and nothing about him or the building or the lobby or the street outside had been different from any other evening when she'd come down and gone out and come back. The world had continued to be the world. The channel had continued to be open. Both of these things were true at the same time, which she understood was the nature of this, the thing she was learning to carry. Nothing on the outside was different and everything on the inside was different, and she was the only point where those two facts met. She went back upstairs. The apartment was the same apartment it had been 2 hours ago. Legal pad on the table, books on the table, clean jacket in the closet, kitchen window still open. From the apartment below, the garlic smell that had been there earlier had faded, replaced by something slightly sweeter, a dessert or a candle, gone before she could identify it. The oak through the front window was a dark shape against the city sky, the ambient glow of a million lit windows raising the floor of the night to something that wasn't quite darkness and wasn't quite light. She stood at the kitchen window for a while. The rear courtyard below was empty, the path lamp on, its light making the brick and the ivy visible in the way a single lamp made things visible in the dark. Edges sharp, centers soft. 100 nights at least at this window, in all the seasons this building had. The dogwood and the ivy and the brick wall as familiar as the tree root on Dumbarton. Her attention could rest there without effort. She thought about what it meant to carry something that couldn't be written in the legal pad. The legal pad was her instrument for the things she was holding. 4 columns of routing metadata and node architecture and a Portland asset and an inferred package, all of it in her own compressed shorthand, legible to her and possibly to someone who knew the ICD's administrative language well enough to read the shorthand as what it was. The legal pad was the external instrument for things she was working through, the physical counterpart to the watching place. She'd been using it since the P Street office, adding lines to it as the shape of the thing she was watching became clearer. The ask couldn't go in the legal pad. It wasn't that she decided not to write it down. It was that writing it down was structurally not a thing she could do. The ask hadn't arrived in any form that produced text. It had arrived in a form that produced understanding, which was different, and the understanding couldn't be compressed into shorthand without losing the thing that made it what it was. She understood this the way she understood the inadequacy of describing it, by the gap between the experience and the available language for the experience. The gap was information. She was learning to treat it as such. What she could hold was the shape of it. Go, be present, recover, carry it back. 4 elements she could name, each one pointing at something larger than the name. She held the 4 elements the way she held everything in the watching place. Not tight, not forced, with the kind of attention that let the thing remain what it was rather than compressing it into something manageable. This was new. She'd always worked with things that could be compressed, the administrative architecture of a shadow program, the routing metadata of her own assignments, the shorthand of a legal pad's 4th column. This was the first thing she'd been given that resisted compression without losing itself. The channel was still open. A cup of tea she probably wouldn't drink, set on the kitchen table. The legal pad stayed closed. The books stayed where they were. None of the things she did when she was between things she wasn't. Inside something now in the earliest moments of being inside it before she understood its shape or its dimensions or what the being inside it would require. The count was 46. She thought about it with the steadiness she'd developed for thinking about it since the read-in. 46 people. The program had sent her to 46 people, and she had done what the program sent her to do, and the program had sent her to those 46 people in service of something it had known and she hadn't, and now she knew. The number didn't change with the knowing. The weight didn't change. What changed was the context, and context was the difference between a number and a meaning, and she understood now, more fully than she had in any of the 3 months since the read-in, what the number meant. The ask was connected to the 46. Not directly, not causally, not in any way she could trace directly. But she understood, sitting with the ask and the count at the kitchen table in the July apartment, that the configuration of her that had made her the person the ask was sent to included the number. The drawer held the number. The drawer held the photograph and the gradient file and the chip and the count, and all of it together was what she was. And what she was what the ask required. Outside, the street was doing what it did after 9 on a weekday in July. A car every few minutes, the occasional voice, the oak. Inside, the tea in the mug had gone warm rather than hot, and she hadn't touched it and wouldn't. The ceiling fan turned its slow circles. Nothing filed, nothing reported, nobody told. The machine didn't know. Whatever was next, wherever the location was, whatever the when and the how were, she didn't know either. What she knew was the shape of the ask and the fact of having received it and the fact of not having closed it, and all 3 were in the watching place now. And the watching place held them the way it held everything. Visible, attended to, unresolved. She thought about the machine for a while. The program she'd worked inside for 15 years, the administrative machinery of an organization running since 1947 on technology it understood operationally and not theoretically, making decisions through a chain she'd been near the bottom of and was still, even after the read-in, near the bottom of. The machine had sent her to 46 people, and she'd closed them, and the machine had received the reports and moved on, and the machine was still running, still routing assignments through its Tier 5 infrastructure, still maintaining the secondary program and the outer installations and the back-channel protocols, and all the rest of what the read-in had given her the frame to see. The machine didn't know she was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone warm and a channel open that it hadn't opened. The machine was doing what the machine did: processing, routing, managing, maintaining. She'd worked inside the machine for 15 years, and she understood it the way you understood a building you'd worked in for 15 years, from the inside, functionally, by what it did, and what it didn't do, and what happened when you moved through it correctly, and what happened when you moved through it wrong. The machine had given her 46 assignments, and she'd completed all 46 correctly, which was what correctness meant inside the machine. And the machine had gotten what it needed from each completion and moved on, and she'd gotten the next assignment, and the machine had continued. What the machine hadn't accounted for, as far as she could tell sitting at the kitchen table in the July apartment 3 months after the read-in, was her. Not in the sense that she was surprising to the machine. The machine had chosen her, had read in her, had moved her through the Tier 5 architecture toward the position she was now in, and had done all of that precisely because of what she was. The machine knew what she was. The machine had understood what she was before she did. What the machine hadn't accounted for was that what she was included the ability to receive something from outside the machine, and that receiving something from outside the machine while being inside the machine created a condition the machine hadn't designed for. She wondered briefly if this was what had happened with the prior peak. Some of the people inside whatever the prior peak's version of the machine was, reaching a point where they were capable of receiving something the machine hadn't designed them to receive, and then making a decision about that. She let the thought run a short distance and then set it down, because she didn't have enough information to know where it led, and she'd learned since the read-in to set down the lines of inquiry that ran out ahead of her information. The prior peak was in the frame the read-in had given her, present as a shape without substance, the outline of a thing she understood structurally without understanding in substance. What had happened to the prior peak was what she was now, in the earliest moments of this, trying to make sure didn't happen the same way again, or what the echo was trying to make sure didn't happen the same way again. The instrument through which the echo was making that attempt, that was her. The attempt would succeed or not succeed, and she wouldn't know until she went, and she hadn't been told where to go, and the where would come when the time came, and the time hadn't come yet. She sat with the cup of tea and the legal pad and the July Street and the oak. The apartment building made its sounds. She'd learned all of them in 3 years. The particular knock of the heating pipe on the 3rd floor, the specific sound the elevator cable made when the car stopped at her floor, the way the wind hit the roof on the west side and produced a low-frequency vibration she'd thought for the first 2 weeks was structural, and then understood was normal, and then stopped hearing as distinct from the building's general ambient. All of it present tonight as it was every night, exactly as she'd left it, exactly as it would be when she came back from wherever she was going. She would come back. That was another fact she was holding. She would come back from wherever the ask was sending her, with whatever the being present gave her, and she would carry it back. And the carrying back would be the most important thing she'd done in 15 years of carrying things. The machine would still be here when she came back. Walt would still be at his desk or on his extinguisher circuit or in the basement checking the panel. The apartment would still have the oak outside the front window and the courtyard with the dogwood and the path lamp outside the kitchen window and the crack in the sidewalk outside the dry cleaner and the corner store with the bell. All of it's still here. She thought about that for a while longer, sitting with the tea, and then she put the cup in the sink and washed it, running the water cold because she didn't want to wait for hot, and dried it and put it back in the cabinet, and turned off the kitchen light. The apartment was the same apartment, Legal pad on the table, books on the table, clean jacket now in the closet. Kitchen window still open, the oak visible through the front window against the darkening sky. From the apartment below, garlic and oil in a pan, the smell coming up through the floor in the slow way smells moved through this building. She sat at the table and didn't open the legal pad. There was nothing to add to it yet. The watching place held the 4 columns and it now held the ask. And the ask was large enough that the 4 columns had become, without her deciding this, context rather than content. The mechanism by which she'd been positioned for the thing, rather than the thing itself. The table had a coffee ring on its surface she'd stopped seeing years ago, an incomplete circle from a mug she couldn't remember, and she saw it clearly now. The count was 46. She'd been thinking about it more since the read-in, the way you thought more about a number when you understood what it was a number of. Not with guilt. Guilt was not the operational register she worked in, and it wasn't available to her for this even when she looked for it, which she occasionally did, checking whether it was there the way you check a room. 46 was the weight the number had accumulated over 15 years, and she chose to carry the weight rather than not carry it. And she'd made that choice a long time ago without calling it a choice. The read-in had given the weight more context. Context didn't make it lighter. She thought about the ask against the count, thought about who had sent it and why. The Echo had been watching humanity for longer than the ICD had existed, had been in back-channel contact for 11 years, had been giving information without asking for anything in return. The ask had come directly to her clearance, bypassing every institutional structure the program had built, after 11 years of working through the program's channels. The fact that they'd stopped working through the program's channels and sent directly to her clearance told her what they understood about the situation, about the machine and its limits, and what the machine would do with certain kinds of information if it received them. They'd looked at her the way Level 0 had looked at her, the way whoever had been managing her channel had looked at her, and they'd concluded something. What the conclusion was, she was still working out. The shape of it was present without the center being nameable. She put her hand in the inside left pocket of her jacket. Her fingers found the photograph without searching, the way they always found it. The slight stiffness of a photograph that had been handled many times over many years without being damaged. She didn't take it out. Her hand held it through the fabric for a moment, feeling the weight of something she'd been carrying for 6 years in this jacket, and before that in other jackets through assignments she could no longer distinguish by location. And then she moved her hand away from the pocket and set it flat on the kitchen table. The channel was still open. Outside, the street had gone to the ambient that Georgetown settled into after 9 on a weekday in July. A car every few minutes, the occasional voice, the oak converting the last movement of the evening into sound. Inside, the garlic smell from the floor below had faded. The kitchen window was still open. The ceiling fan turned its slow circles. Nothing filed, nothing reported, nobody told. The machine didn't know. The Tier 5 architecture managing her channel didn't know. The person above her chain who had been managing her assignments didn't know. Whatever the next thing was, the location, the when, the how, she didn't know either. What she knew was the shape of the ask and the fact of her having received it, and both of those were now in the watching place. And the watching place held them the way it held everything. Visible, attended to, unresolved. She sat in the dark and held it and did not know yet what holding it meant.